Hello everyone, I am Clara Jean Aparada and I will be the first reporter for the chapter 5 Person Centered Therapy. The following are our topic outline. We will first discuss about Carl Rogers, 1902 to 1987. Second is the four periods of development of the approach. Third, existentialism and humanism. Fourth, Abraham Maslow's contributions to humanistic psychology. Fifth, the vision of humanistic psychology. And lastly, are the key concepts. And for our intended learning outcomes for this chapter, by the end of this topic or chapter, you must be able to 1. Articulate and critique the key concepts of person centered therapy as applied in counseling and trace their implications for intervention. 2. Demonstrate person-centered therapeutic techniques and procedures. Carl Rogers, a major spokesperson for humanistic psychology, led a life that reflected the ideas he developed for half a century. He showed a questioning stance, a deep openness to change, and the courage to forge into unknown territory both as a person and as a professional. In writing about his early years, Rogers recalled his family atmosphere as characterized by close and warm relationships but also by strict religious standards. Play was discouraged, and the virtues of the Protestant ethic were extolled. His boyhood was somewhat lonely, and he pursued scholarly interests instead of social ones. Rogers was an introverted person, and he spent a lot of time reading and engaging in imaginative activity and reflection. During his college years, his interest and academic major changed from agriculture to history, then to religion, and finally to clinical psychology. Rogers held academic positions in various fields, including education, social work, counseling, psychotherapy, group therapy, peace, and interpersonal relations, and he earned recognition around the world for originating and developing the humanistic movement in psychotherapy. His foundational ideas, especially the central role of the client therapist relationship as a means to growth and change, have been incorporated by many other theoretical approaches. According to Cain 2010, Rogers was a pioneer whose groundbreaking discoveries continue to have a far-reaching effects on the field of psychotherapy. It is difficult to overestimate the significance of Rogers' contributions to clinical and counseling psychology. He was a courageous pioneer who was about 50 years ahead of his time and has been waiting for us to catch up. Rogers was first to study the counseling process in depth by analyzing the transcripts of actual therapy sessions. He was the first clinician to conduct major studies in psychotherapy using quantitative methods. He was the first to formulate a comprehensive theory of personality and psychotherapy grounded in empirical research, and he contributed to developing a theory of psychotherapy and de-emphasized pathology and focused on the strengths and resources of individuals. He was not afraid to take a strong position and challenge the status quo throughout his professional career. During the last 15 years of his life, Rogers applied a person centered approach to world peace by training policymakers, leaders, and groups in conflict. Perhaps his greatest passion was directed toward the reduction of interracial tensions and the effort to achieve world peace, for which he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Four periods of development of the approach. In tracing the major turning points in Rogers' approach, Zimring and Raskin 1992 have identified four periods of development. In the first period, during the 1940s, Rogers developed what was known as non directive counseling, which provided a powerful and revolutionary alternative to the directive and interpretive approaches to therapy then being practiced. In 1942, while he was a professor at the Ohio State University, Rogers published Counseling and Psychotherapy Neuroconcepts in Practice, which described the philosophy and practice of non directive counseling. Rogers' theory emphasized the counselor's creation of a permissive and non directive climate. His theory took power away from the therapist and honored the inherent power of the client. According to Elkins 2009, when he challenged the basic assumption that the counselor knows best, he realized this radical idea would affect the power dynamics and politics of the counseling profession, and indeed, it caused a great furor. In the second period, during the 1950s, Rogers wrote Client Centered Therapy and renamed his approach Client Centered Therapy to reflect its emphasis on the client rather than on non directive methods. In addition, he started a counseling center at the University of Chicago. This period was characterized by a shift from clarification of feelings to a focus on the phenomenological world of the client. Rogers assumed that the best vantage point for understanding how people behave was from their own internal frame of reference. He focused more explicitly on the actualizing tendency as the basic motivational force that leads to client change. The third period, which began in the late 1950s and extended into the 1970s, address the necessary and sufficient conditions of therapy. Rogers set forth a hypothesis that resulted in 3 decades of research. A significant publication was on Becoming a Person, Rogers 1961, which addressed the nature of becoming the self that one truly is, an idea he borrowed from Kierkegaard. Rogers published this work during the time that he held joint appointments in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin. In this book, he described the process of becoming one's experience, which is characterized by an openness to experience, a trust in one's experience, an internal locus of evaluation, and the willingness to be in process. During the 1950s and 1960s, Rogers and his associates continued to test the underlying hypothesis of the client centered approach by conducting extensive research on both the process and the outcomes of psychotherapy. He was interested in how people best progress in psychotherapy, and he studied the qualities of the client therapist relationship as a catalyst leading to personality change. On the basis of this research, the approach was further refined and expanded. For example, client centered philosophy was applied to education and was called student centered teaching. The approach was also applied to encounter groups. The fourth phase, during the 1980s and the 1990s, was marked by considerable expansion to education, couples and families, industry groups, conflict resolution, politics, and the search for world peace. Because of Rogers' ever widening scope of influence, including his interest in how people obtain, possess, share, or surrender power and control over others and themselves, his theory became known as the person centered approach. This shift in terms reflected the broadening application of the approach. Although the person centered approach has been applied mainly to individual and group counseling, important areas of further application include education, family life, leadership and administration, organizational development, healthcare, cross cultural and interracial activity, and international relations. It was during the 1980s that Rogers directed his efforts toward applying the person centered approach to politics, especially to efforts related to the achievement of world peace. In a comprehensive review of the research on person centered therapy over a period of 60 years, Bozard, Zimring, and Touch 2002 concluded the following. In the earliest years of the approach, the client rather than the therapist determined the direction and goals of therapy, and the therapist's role was to help the client clarify feelings. This style of non directive therapy was associated with increased understanding, greater self exploration, and improved self concepts. Later, a shift from clarification of feelings to a focus on the client's lived experiences took place. Many of Rogers' hypotheses were confirmed, and there was strong evidence for the value of that therapeutic relationship and the client's resources as the crux of successful therapy. As, as person centered therapy developed further, research centered on the core conditions assumed to be both necessary and sufficient for successful therapy: the attitude of the therapist, an empathic understanding of the client's world, and the ability to communicate a non judgmental stance to the client, along with the therapist's genuineness, were found to be basic to a successful therapy outcome. The main source of successful psychotherapy is the client. The therapist's attention to the client's frame of reference fosters the client's utilization of inner and outer resources. Existentialism and humanism. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a growing interest among counselors in a third force in therapy as an alternative to the psychoanalytic and behavioral approaches. Partly because of this historical connection and partly because representatives of existentialist thinking and humanistic thinking have not always clearly sorted out their views. The connections between the terms existentialism and humanism have tended to be confusing for students and theorists alike. The two viewpoints have much in common, yet there also are significant philosophical differences between them. They share a respect for the client's subjective experience, the uniqueness and individuality of each client, and the trust in the capacity of the client to make positive and constructive conscious choices. They also have in common an emphasis on concepts such as freedom, choice, values, personality, responsibility, autonomy, purpose, and meaning. Both approaches place little value on the role of techniques in the therapeutic process and emphasize instead the importance of genuine encounter. They differ in that existentialists take the position that we are faced with the anxiety of choosing to create an identity in a world that lacks intrinsic meaning. Existentialists tend to acknowledge the stark realities of human experience, and their writings often focus on death, anxiety, depression, and isolation. The humanists, in contrast, take the somewhat less anxiety evoking position and more optimistic view that each of us has a natural potential that we can actualize and through which we can find meaning. Many contemporary existential therapists refer to themselves as existential humanistic practitioners, indicating that their roots are in existential philosophy but that they have incorporated many aspects of North American humanistic psychotherapies. The phenomenological emphasis that is basic to the existentialist approach is also fundamental to person centered theory. Both approaches focus on the client's perceptions and call for the therapist to be fully present with the client so that it is possible to understand the client's subjective world, and they both emphasize the client's capacity for self awareness and self healing. The therapist aims to provide the client with a safe, responsive, and caring relationship to facilitate self exploration, growth, and healing. Abraham Maslow's contributions to humanistic psychology. Abraham Maslow, 1970, was a pioneer in the development of humanistic psychology and was influential in furthering the understanding of self actualizing individuals. Many of Carl Rogers' ideas, especially on the positive aspect of being human and the fully functioning person, are built on Maslow's basic philosophy. Maslow criticized Freudian psychology for what he saw as its preoccupation with the sick and negative side of human nature. Maslow believed that too much research was being conducted on anxiety, hostility, and neurosis, and too little into joy, creativity, and self fulfillment. Self actualization was the central theme of the work of Abraham Maslow. The positive psychology movement that recently has come into prominence shares many concepts on the healthy side of human existence with the humanistic approach. Maslow studied what he called self actualizing people and found that they differed in important ways from so called normal individuals. The core characteristics of self actualizing people are self awareness, freedom, basic honesty and caring, and trust and autonomy. Other characteristics of self actualizing individuals include a capacity to welcome uncertainty in their lives, acceptance of themselves and others, spontaneity and creativity, a need of privacy and solitude, autonomy, a capacity for deep and intense interpersonal relationships, a genuine caring for others, an inner directedness as opposed to the tendency to live by others' expectations, the absence of artificial dichotomies within themselves, such as work, play, love, hate, and weak, strong, and a sense of humor. Maslow postulated a hierarchy of needs as a source of motivation, with the most basic needs being physiological needs. If we are hungry and thirsty, our attention is riveted on meeting these basic needs. Next are the safety needs, which include a sense of security and stability. Once our physical and safety needs are fulfilled, we become concerned with meeting our needs for belonging and love, followed by working on our need for esteem, both from self and others. We are able to strive towards self actualization only after these four basic needs are met. The key factor determining which need is dominant at a given time is the degree to which those below it are satisfied. We cannot strive towards self actualization, for example, if our self esteem is low. The vision of humanistic philosophy. The underlying vision of humanistic philosophy is captured by the metaphor of how an acorn, if provided with the appropriate conditions, will automatically grow in positive ways, pushed naturally toward its actualization as an oak. In contrast, for many existentialists, there is nothing that we are, no internal nature we can count on. We are faced at every moment with a choice about what to make of this condition. Maslow's emphasis on the healthy side of being human and the emphasis on joy, creativity, and self fulfillment are part of the person centered philosophy. The humanistic philosophy on which the person centered approach rests is expressed in attitudes and behaviors that create a growth producing climate. According to Rogers, when this philosophy is lived, it helps people develop their capacities and stimulates constructive change in others. Individuals are empowered and they are able to use this power for personal and social transformation. Lastly, for our key concepts, view of human nature. A common theme originating in Rogers' early writing and continuing to permeate all of his works is a basic sense of trust in the client's ability to move forward in a constructive manner if conditions fostering growth are present. In keeping with the philosophy of humanistic psychology, Rogers firmly maintained that people are trustworthy, resourceful, capable of self understanding and self direction, able to make constructive changes, and able to live effective and productive lives. When therapists are able to experience and communicate their realness, support, caring, and non judgmental understanding, significant changes in the client are most likely to occur. Rogers maintained that three therapist attributes create a growth promoting climate in which individuals can move forward and become what they are capable of becoming. First is congruence, genuineness or realness. Second, unconditional positive regard, acceptance and caring. And third, accurate empathic understanding, an ability to deeply grasp the subjective world of another person. According to Rogers, if therapists communicate these attitudes, those being helped will become less defensive and more open to themselves and their world, and they will behave in pro-social and constructive ways. Broadly, 1999 writes about the actualizing tendency, a directional process of striving toward realization, fulfillment, autonomy, and self-determination. This natural inclination of humans is based on Maslow's studies of self-actualizing people. This growth force within us provides an internal source of healing, but it does not imply a movement away from relationships, interdependence, connection, or socialization. This humanistic view of human nature has significant implications for the practice of therapy because of the belief that the individual has an inherent capacity to move away from maladjustment and towards psychological health and growth. The therapist places the primary responsibility on the client. The person centered approach rejects the role of the therapist as the authority who knows best and of the passive client who merely follows the beliefs of the therapist. Therapy is rooted in the client's capacity for awareness and self directed change in attitudes and behaviors. By promoting self awareness and self reflection, clients learn to exercise choice. Humanistic therapists emphasize a discovery oriented approach in which clients are the experts on their own inner experience. And they encourage clients to make changes that will lead to living fully and authentically with the realization that this kind of existence demands a continuing struggle. Maslow taught us that becoming self actualizing individuals is an ongoing process rather than a final destination.